Since the UFC went to Paramount, one of the most biggest and heaviest criticisms I have seen is that the fight cards are no longer good. And I have even seen people say that the numbered events like UFC 327 aren't good either. But I personally think that the quality of the fights on the fight card themselves have increased since moving to Paramount, and I think the matchmaking is better than ever before. I think a perfect example of this is the most recent fight card, Aljamain Sterling versus Yusuf Zalal. When you take an overview of the entire fight card, it doesn't really get you excited, and I'll talk about that more in a second. But looking at the card, if we were matchmakers or doing matchmaking, we would say no way this would work, but it did. The quality of the fights on the card itself were absolutely incredible. There wasn't a boring fight on that card. Starting with the first fight on the preliminary card, which was a 3-round war, moving all the way to the 5-round main event, where Aljamain Sterling had a dominant performance over Yusuf Zalal. The entire fight card was thoroughly entertaining. Now, some people will probably say that that card was boring because a lot of the fights went to decisions and there wasn't a lot of finishes. I think that's somewhat of a casual viewpoint, and I don't think a fight has to end in a submission or a knockout to be entertaining. You're watching the greatest fighters in the world fight their ass off for 3 to 5 rounds when it goes to a decision. You're watching absolute scraps, whether it's a stand-up and box and strike match or a heavy grappling match. And I don't know how people can call themselves fans of the sport and not enjoy the skills and techniques that are on display at the highest level. Now, I'm not saying no fight is boring, but 98% of the fights are just fine. And I feel like people are complaining just to complain. And people have complained about every single fight card since the UFC went to Paramount. And it's been like that with other cards as well. People complained about UFC 327, and people complained about Moicano and Duncan, like Burns versus Mallet, which was an incredible card. The fight between Thiago Moises and Gage Young was good. Jasmine Jandirovic versus Silva was good. Jai Herbert versus Nala was a good fight. Charles Jourdain versus Kyler Phillips was a great fight. And Gilbert Burns versus Mike Malott was an incredible fight. And I feel like the fights have been more entertaining now in the Paramount era than they were in the ESPN era. I feel like now when I'm watching the fights, I'm seeing a much more skill-based matchmaking, if you will, where fighters are fighting other fighters who are just as good as them. And when it was in the ESPN era, it honestly felt like it was more focused on very big mismatchups, where one dude would absolutely dominate the other one. But for some reason, since the fights went to Paramount, I think they're a lot better than they used to be. And I think the reason that is because of the bigger bonuses. You could get a 100K fight of the night bonus and a 100K performance bonus of the night. And also there is a $25,000 finish bonus for fighters to earn as well, where if they win by submission or knockout, they get 25K. And I think that makes fighters work harder. I think they're willing to take a lot more risk than that octagon. And I think that makes for a much more entertaining fight. Or like I said, maybe it's better matchmaking, because now it feels more skill-based, where we're seeing a fighter fight another fighter just as good as them, rather than a big mismatch that I felt with the ESPN era, or at least that's what it seems like to me. Now, I will say that I do think the fight cards are a little less exciting, and I do think they have a little less hype behind them. And what I mean by this is that if you look at a fight card now compared to a year ago, you might not see a lot of names you recognize. But the big names that people know and love are kind of gone. Those fighters have either retired from the sport or been cut by the UFC. And when you look at a fight card now, you see a lot of new and unrecognizable names. But that's because we're seeing a new generation of fighter entering the UFC. When you look at the top 15 of any division in the UFC, it's almost unrecognizable to what it was just a few years ago. And I think that's something that's way beyond the UFC's control. I've been watching the sport for nearly 10 years now, and when I've been seeing some of the cards that Paramount has been announcing recently, I definitely don't recognize as many names as I used to. And I definitely think that makes it a little less hype, and I think there's a little bit less excitement behind the fight cards for long-term fans like myself. Like I said earlier, I think this is more of a new generation entering the UFC and replacing the old one kind of problem, and I think that's beyond the UFC's control. But I do think the fights have been amazing lately, and I think these young, new-name fighters are proving they are just as hungry and determined as the old ones. And in my opinion, this new generation of fighter is much more skilled than the other one, and I think that's might be why the fights have been so entertaining recently as well, just because the level of talent now is so high in the UFC. I believe if you give it a few months, maybe a year, people will probably start to recognize the names of the new fighters fighting in the UFC, and I think that little bit of hype and that little bit of excitement will come back. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying the fight cards aren't exciting. They are. And I'm always hyped for a fight card. You're watching the best fighters in the world compete in the biggest MMA organization in the world for a shot at being champion. And like I said in my other videos in the past, I have respect for anybody who steps in that octagon on Saturday night to entertain us, and I appreciate the art of fighting, no matter who is fighting on the card. However, let's be completely honest, if you've been a fan of the sport long enough, you know people have always complained about fight cards. Every single week about how the fights, cards, and fights were terrible long before the UFC was on Paramount. Remember when people complained about UFC 300, which was one of the best fight cards, UFC 303, another one of the best fight cards? People complained about UFC Noche, and that was an incredible experience and an amazing fight card. Some fans will never be happy no matter how good the card is. We have people complaining about the White House fight card, and that is one of the most stacked cards I've ever seen. And there's going to be some incredible fights. Now, I have seen some people talk about the quality of the broadcast itself, saying that there's more commercials than there was on ESPN. People specifically complaining about the ads during the cornering of the fighters in between rounds, when that wasn't a thing back in the day. People also complained about ads on the walkouts to where we weren't seeing the walkouts anymore. However, the UFC fights are basically free from what they used to cost. Remember, you would need like an ESPN Plus subscription, and then you would need to pay for pay-per-view on top of that. So it was like $100 a month just to be a fan of the sport. And now you can pay like $10 a month or $60 a year, whatever it is, and get access to every single pay-per-view and every single fight night, along with all the other stuff that they put on there. In my opinion, I think we're seeing so many people complain about the fight cards being trash is simply because the sport has gone mainstream, or at least more mainstream than it used to be. And there are a lot more fans in the space than there used to be, and that's because of the Paramount Plus deal. The sport is more popular than ever before. I mean, we're having a fight on the White House lawn. You have fighters doing streams with some of the biggest streamers in the world that get hundreds of thousands of views, millions of views in clips. You have UFC fighters doing their own social media where some of them have like 2 million followers. You have fighters starting their own podcast. The fighters and the sport itself are more popular than ever before, and it's only going to continue to rise in popularity. And I think with that comes a lot of casual viewpoints. But what do you guys think? Do you think things have gotten better or worse since the UFC moved to Paramount? What don't you like about Paramount? What do you like about Paramount? Are there any changes that you want to see? Let me know down in the comment section below. I would really appreciate it. Also, if you have any ideas for future videos, any feedback on how I could do better, leave that down below as well. I really do appreciate it. And I really would appreciate somebody taking the time to answer some of those questions, because a lot of what I get are like people trying to be funny, and I'm trying to create a space where it's MMA fans talking about MMA, where there's actual conversation going on rather than just nonsense and drama. Anyways, I love you guys. I hope to see you back here in the next one. Peace out. Have a good one. Bye bye everybody, and adios.